It's Here we
Welcome.
are.
Go
Go for
ahead.
it, Heather. Go
Okay.
for it.
Welcome back, everyone. We have an absolutely fantastic show for you today, so we're really glad that you're tuning in. We love you. We appreciate you coming in every week and participating with us, giving us your questions. We're going to have a fascinating show today. Our guest is Lilian Haga. She is a graduate of the University of Vienna. She has master's degrees in political science and Arabic and Islamic studies. Her list of accomplishments goes on and on, so I could introduce her forever, but I'm just going to let you tell us just a little bit about yourself, give us an idea of who you are, how you spend your days, and what we can look forward to hearing about from you.
Well, I'm not going to start with the part with how I spent my days because I just graduated from university and I'm basically looking for jobs all the time, so that is the least fascinating part. As you already mentioned, I spent the past few years studying at the University of Vienna and writing 2 master theses, of which the first one was for me personally also the most interesting and the one that really moved me and touched me. Because I was writing about poetry in Sudan during the revolution, mainly women's poetry, and I got to interview truly fascinating and amazing women. And that actually also inspired me in a way to start sharing my own poetry more, which turned into this whole thing where I started writing a lot more poetry and started getting published more and started hosting my own poetry show during the first lockdown, not so much after that, admittedly. So yeah, and I got more and more involved also personally in poetry and how poetry can just build community and empower people. So yeah.
That's amazing. So give us, like, we always like who you are today, but give us an idea of what your journey was like. Was poetry always in your life? Was academics always in your life? Was this kind of a natural path for you, or did it all come together like at the last minute?
Well, it did not come together at last minute. I think my journey, I think I'm a person who always sits at the border of things and the intersections, because I always wanted to do journalism actually, and started doing that and started writing like that and started realizing like I want to tell stories from a deeper perspective. I want to do research that goes deeper than what most journalism, like the more superficial sort of journalism that doesn't just have the time can do. So that is where academics came in. And then I realized like academics is amazing, but it doesn't really tell the personal stories. It doesn't really leave that much room for the creative side. And that's where poetry came in. And I've been writing ever since I can remember, like poetry, short stories, long stories, unfinished stories, a lot of those actually. And so that all always came together. And for me, it was always like, if I spend too much time doing just one of those, one of the other would lack. And for me, like the fascinating side of all is always when you add a different perspective to it. So for poetry, I love adding like sometimes even academic knowledge and transform that into poetry, or like what moves me when I do academics. And for example, a lot of my poetry is about feminism and tries to capture the ideas that I read about or that I write about then in poetry and bring that to people closer. So yeah, I think it all has always intersected, and there were different phases sometimes where one or the other was stronger, but it was always all there.
I mean, that's beautiful, because when you were describing it, I was thinking, okay, you've got the academic part, and that can be a little bit cut and dry. It's very dispassionate research. You should try to be a little bit more dispassionate. Then you've got journalism that's a little bit like that, but you're right, with the timing of journalism, it's not like you spend a lot of time. And then you find the heart of all of it with poetry. I would have never thought that all those things could fit together, but they did. So when you're going through school, did you know that you wanted, so you did 2 theses. You had to do 2. For, most people only
Well,
start at 1, and you did 2?
Yeah, I think like everybody who knows me will just start laughing the moment you ask this question, because they will say like, yeah, we knew, just she didn't. I did 2 bachelor degrees, and after that I promised myself I would just do 1 master's, but I didn't know which one of those, so I started both, and I just never could decide which one to drop and which one not to. And then it was like 3 semesters later, and I had done all the courses, and I was just like, okay, yeah, I'm going to write both theses. And actually, with the subjects that I took, I have to admit I did complain a lot, and it was tough sitting that long at home and just working on this and writing it. But I also had a lot of fun, to be honest. So.
But did you know that you were going to have the topic be, oh, did we lose her?
No, we did not lose her.
No?
Yeah. So did you know your topic was going to be about that intersection of academics, of feminism, poetry? Was that kind of like your North Star? You were always kind of going that way?
With the master's and the poetry part, pretty much yes. Because very much in the beginning of my master's, I went to Sudan for 3 weeks. And that was a fascinating experience, mostly because of the people I met, most of them actually women. And those connections and friendships have really lasted very long now, or are still lasting. And at the time then, I was already pretty sure that I wanted to write about Sudan. And the poetry part is actually, I don't really remember how that came along, because I think I was reading some sort of article text, and there was a footnote about this this function that poetry fulfills for women, and I was like, this is fascinating. I want to look more into that. So I think it was a footnote somewhere.
That's
Yeah.
great.
What you saw a few minutes ago when you said, oh, did we lose her?
Mhm.
I was, you had an interview with the amazing Ishraga, who is, she's doing an amazing, fascinating work in Venice and in different areas in the world. And I told Lillian she doesn't need to prepare, because I know it was a lot of work. And I know that between me and Heather, we can get you to talk for hours, not just 1 hour.
Probably,
But
yeah.
if this is the part with, she had her PowerPoints. And if you want me to play some of it, this way people will understand, I can do that. Otherwise, we can continue talking, because I think here you said something about how this whole thing started.
You have the PowerPoint. This is why I can see myself.
All right, let me show you.
I was see myself in a different outfit. How did I manage that?
Okay, can you guys hear it? I don't think you can, because I have it muted here.
Is it possible for me to share the screen, because I also have a presentation actually?
It's weird. women's poetry during the revolution. My personal interest in Sudan strongly stems from a longer trip in 2016 with the university, and my interest in poetry, and specifically women's poetry, aside from being a poet myself, as you mentioned, Hagir, stems from reading about the Hakamat. For those listeners who may be not familiar with them, they are important female figures in several regions of Sudan, for example, like Darfur, who exert influence in the communities through poetry. So eventually my overarching research question was, how do Sudanese women use poetry within contemporary society and in political movements? With the sub-questions like which functions poetry fulfills regarding political expression, both for women in Sudan, but also the diaspora during the uprising, and then eventually how powerful women's poetry and social movements is, and how that power is actually constituted. Just a couple of words to the research design. As mentioned before, I conduct interviews with 9 women and 1 man, all of them qualitative interviews, so very open. We just talked a lot. And all of them were conducted between January and August of 2019, although most of them actually were in June, July, and August. And I had contacted the interview partners either via social media, as there was a lot of poetry shared on social media during the revolution, or they had been referred to me, like for example, Ishaga, or had opened an open call via social media. So an important limitation of my research is already apparent here, which is the demographic. So the demographic was mainly representative of a younger social media apt generation. And another limitation is language, because I could only consider poets who were writing either in English or in Arabic. So none of the other languages in Sudan, which is really diverse considering languages. Although quite a portion of my thesis then also analyzes, not analyzes, but depicts several movements. I think in the setting, I really didn't have to talk about that. So maybe just a few words to place my research in the wider context of research on women's poetry in Sudan. Fundamentally, there is a really long tradition of women using poetry as a mode of resistance, and at times like a weapon against outside invasion in the communities, for example, also importantly in anti-colonial struggles. And Baqi Badawi Muhammad wrote a really interesting article, for example, in 1996, on women's oral traditions and poetry as resistance. And he, for example, concludes that, quote, resistance led to creation of poetry, but poetry also reformed and reshaped the historical record. So this already points to a very important function of poetry. So jumping to my results. This is now really not good. Wait a second. I can do it like this. Yeah, because otherwise you can't really see the quotes so very well. Yeah, so my findings. I will give the setting tonight mostly focus on my findings regarding poetry in the revolution, though there is much more to say. But just a couple of words on poetry more in general, because I think there were some really important statements made that also introduce how poetry was used in the revolution. So in my very first interview in January 2019, my interview partner Galama said something that really stayed with me ever since, and that perfectly encapsulates the power that poetry can have. She said, quote, "You can say everything with words. You can say anything you want, but you stay protected. I remember being told not to say something disrespectful. With poetry, you are totally free. You can say anything, against anyone, even against God. and no one has the right to tell you that it is disrespectful or not allowed. All my interview partners emphasized how poetry provides a safe space, both on a personal level, in society, but also on a political level, and a way to render also potential critique ambiguous in a way that makes it possible in the first place. So it is a really important place to voice critique, for example, also of the regime. And I have here also argued that since poetry is a traditionally sanctioned and well-regarded medium for women to pass judgment and exert political and social influence, again, here the keyword al-hakamat, poetry can actually have a strong impact. And then, for example, Ishraga in our interview, for example, stressed also the liberatory force of poetry, saying here that, and that is translated from German, writing is a form of liberation. Even before I started writing, I feel it boiling in my blood, in my entire body. There is something in me, I don't know exactly where, in my brain, in my heart. And after I write it down, I feel liberated. It is like a chain around my neck and I can't breathe. And she pointed to how poetry makes it possible to challenge narratives within society through poetry. And then poetry as this safe space for women's expression and a liberatory space to challenge narratives within society then culminates in the power of poetry for political resistance as seen in the Sudanese uprising. I have identified here several overarching functions that poetry fulfilled, both inside Sudan and outside in the diaspora. And I think one of the most visible, most mentioned and tangible functions that we also saw in the video in the beginning was the unifying and motivating character of poetry that is most pronounced in the chants during the protests, which were actually often mentioned by interview partners as a form of poetry. And in my interview with her, Ala Disuni spoke of her experiences during the protests, telling me that, quote, the words themselves were enough to continue. They gave you the strength to fight, and it also gave you healing. And healing here is another important factor that poetry can provide, and is also, I think, something that has become very, very clear in many of the poems I read. For her, like many of the others, it was also the only way to deal with emotions, something that I think Isabella, for example, also mentioned before, that poetry for her was a way to deal with emotions during that time. Another interview partner, LJ, also stressed the role of poetry in giving an external reference point, which I found really interesting. And she said that in order to have morale, you need something outside of yourself that sees you, that recognizes you, that comforts you. If it's a mural you see, a song you hear, a poem that's recited, a chant that gets you, great, it keeps you going. It's outside of you. And this is, for example, also an important way for the diaspora to contribute to the revolution. Here, poetry has this unifying character as well, and given how easily the emotional message of a poem can be understood, it had the ability to quickly transcend borders and also touch people who had formerly no connection to Sudan. Thus, poetry allowed the diaspora to connect to Sudan, but also other people to connect to Sudan, to offer support, contribute to the uprising themselves, and also mobilize worldwide, which was a really important factor. And I think a beautiful example of this that I can just encourage everyone who's interested in it to look up is the Instagram platform Dear Azza, or Azizati Azza, which collected letters to Sudan in the form of poems. And the platform's founder, Khalda El-Jak, for example, summarized in our interview the power of poetry for resistance, also touching upon the importance of dialect in this setting. And she said that To have people speak in your language, and they are not using formal Arabic, but street Sudanese local Arabic, that's the power in language. That's the, I get you, I feel the same way. And I'm talking in your language because I'm this for you. Poetry is just like that. People writing down their raw feelings. It might not get to the president, but it gets to the people. And people get fed into the political process, which is a really important factor of poetry in this instance. And then poetry was often called a weapon or even a superpower, as in the interviews, a term that I have then used as my title. And I think the role of poetry, chants, songs, art, the murals, for example, all that can't really be overemphasized. And I think Sabah Sanhouri, another interview partner, put it very beautifully. She said, it's like the effect when you drop a stone in the river. It will form circles. Words are like this movement. Another important function of poetry in the revolution is that it transcends time, both evoking the past, witnessing and preserving the present, and imagining the future. Especially relevant for women specifically is that poetry was used to evoke iconic female figures of resistance like Azza or Mehira bint Aboud, who was a poet and who is sketched here in the art piece by Inas Satir. And one of my interview partners put it that the return to poetry means return to history. And through this repeated reproduction of women's poetry and those influential female figures in poetry, Sudanese women's contributions to history are interlinked over time and re-evoked, which is a really important thing during the uprising. And then as a contemporary witness, women's poetry poses an important contribution to giving events their full meaning and recording history by making visible women's narratives, experiences, and emotions during this time and preserving them then for future generations. Another interview, again, quote, again by Khalda El-Jak, which I also found very, very interesting, was that she said, I think the role of writing, of poetry, is so powerful when we come to tell the story generations from now about how we were feeling, what the country was going through. And it's not a literal translation of the news, but it's how you were feeling at a specific moment in time. And finally, then, although there would be much more to say because the interviews were rather long, poetry has an important function in imagining a better future, which is also a very strong function here. A central theme that both in the interviews and the poems from the interview partners inside and outside Sudan that was often reflected. And to close with a quote from LJ, another quote that has really stayed with me and that is very strong in my mind. She said that I think what poetry is doing is reminding people of their humanity in inhumane times. Thank you very much for listening and inviting me. And I hope I could give you some impressions from my research, some insights into it. And I'm very excited to chat a little more with you and for your questions.
Now we're back to the real person. All right. Let me X out.
This is a long paper to read.
You're gonna have to X out of this. Can you all hear me well now?
Yep, you look good.
All right. First of all, we have the real one here, Lillian, and we showed her love. I didn't want you to do all this work since you already have done a beautiful job. This is, to me, this is close to my heart because I'm originally from Sudan, and you know the Sudanese revolution was so powerful, and it reached every and each one of us here, like Sudanese in diaspora, or even it reached you. I wanted to know, I always wanted to ask you that last time and I forgot, like how do you feel about this whole revolution and your experience?
What I found so fascinating, I mean, I'm probably not the best person to ask from a completely objective perspective, because I didn't start writing my thesis after the revolution started. I started writing my thesis before the revolution started. And I had to adapt it because of the revolution. And I started writing about the impact poetry could have for social movements. And 3 weeks later, the revolution broke out. And exactly that was happening. But what I witnessed also, like on my social media from people who were completely unaware of Sudan before that, I believe, suddenly started talking about the revolution. And also on, because my poetry Instagram platform is separate from my personal one, on that platform, even there, people who had probably never thought about Sudan in their lives started reposting poetry from Sudan to raise awareness for the revolution. And that was something that I found very fascinating, how the revolution really transcended borders and started impacting people who had until then never interacted with Sudan in any way. And that was also a part that, watching from the outside and from the perspective of a white European, was truly fascinating to see how much it gripped so many people. And I mean, when I say gripped so many people, I mean, that perspective for me is not very objective, because I was already gripped. So of course I paid more attention to that. But still, that was something that I found extremely strong and powerful in that. So yeah, it was an interesting time in seeing how people build communities and how people across borders, across nations, started caring for the same subject, even though, of course, on social media, things are very, very short-lived. And I also found not only poetry, but also art. I met other people who were also talking about the revolution on Instagram, who were, for example, starting to paint to raise awareness, or to draw, to sketch, something like that. And just how at the center of everything, art and song and poetry and community was, especially also when you saw footage from the sit-ins, and what a hub of art and poetry and creativity that also became.
It's interesting when you talk about the outsider perspective, because speaking from myself, there was almost like two different things I was seeing. One is I was seeing the news version, like when you were just we were watching your PowerPoint, you were talking about poetry not being an exact, actually talking about the news, but rather talking about the soul and the emotion and the feelings behind it. So from an outsider perspective, watching the news, maybe violence, maybe trying to get into the politics of it, but then also having this young, vibrant force that was behind everything. And that's kind of where you're talking about it intersecting with murals, poetry, music. So I think your PowerPoint answered my main question, which was why poetry and why women? So is that just more of a safe place where women can speak their mind, is in poetry in that part of the world?
Well, poetry in general has a very, very long tradition in Sudan. So also not just poetry as literary or creative expression, but actually poetry as political expression. I mentioned the hakamat in the PowerPoint before, and they are actually still in some cases in regions like Darfur, for example. They hold a very powerful position in the community as sort of wise women, or definitely in kind of sort of institutions in the community that can judge things and are believed to hold a position of power, but also insight, and to deliver their opinions. They often do that in song or through poetry. So there is this component that poetry is already regarded as something that is powerful and that has political impact. So that was initially why I chose to research women's poetry specifically. And then why poetry in the revolution. I don't know if you remember that picture that really made the news during the revolution of a woman dressed all in white chanting to the crowds. That picture became really famous during the revolution, and it was also when I think like the world, meaning mostly Western media, started paying attention to that. And that was an instance where a woman was chanting poetry to the crowd and people gathering around that. So I think even in this iconic image, there's already this power of poetry becoming visible. And I mean, this image is definitely problematic in many instances because it renders other people very invisible. I'm just bringing, yeah.
I wanted to say that because there are so many women revolutionists who were reading poem at the sitting in Al-Ghiyada, sitting, and so many other powerful women who played a very important part. Like one of the revolutionists, she was named Sa'idat al-Bumban, Sa'idat al-Bumban in Arabic, which means she was the catcher. She catches when they throw those goodness, I can't even.
Yeah, the tear gas.
The tear gas.
Thingies,
This is, I think, to me, should be the iconic, but our culture outside of what they call the third wall, they wanted someone who's dressed nicely. They wanted to see a powerful woman as someone who is just standing, wearing a nice white dress and looking nice, standing on the top of the car, where the reality, if anyone looked at the sittings or saw the revolutionists, you will see women hand on hand, side by side, catching tear gas. We have one revolutionist who lost her eye, so many that lost their limbs. We still cannot find many of our young revolutionists who were killed and their whereabouts not known so far. We have so many that died military, and yet what catches our eyes is this clean photograph-like material, and it became an iconic. And I'm not putting anyone down, but our standards are very, very strange to me. And I think that's what you were going to say, Lillian, right?
Yeah, I think in every single interview that I had, if we talked about this image, if it came up in some way, there was always a lot of critique around that image, also because it again, and that is something that I, for example, also mentioned before, what my research couldn't do was cover poetry from different languages in Sudan. I could only cover Arabic and English poetry. And that also means that, again, so many of the women who are rendered invisible in Sudan politically do not appear in my research. And I think that is also very symbolic, again, of that image.
So this is kind of like a basic question, but how do people in the area, how do they even learn? Is it just from birth? They kind of are surrounded with the history and the purpose of poetry. How do you find your voice? How does someone actually learn that? Because imagine, I mean, I'm in Pennsylvania in America. Poetry isn't even something that I think we even talked about in school. Maybe it was a chapter. And so for me, it is like almost like hollowed ground. Like I don't even know that I could go there. So how do they even begin?
That is not a question that I can answer you, because I was raised very, very much like you in this way. For me, in school, I mean, okay, I come from Germany. We have Goethe and Schiller, which is like we learn about this kind of poetry. But if I learn about poetry in school, then you must believe that poetry is dead, because all famous German poets you ever learn about are dead, and mostly old white men.
Yes.
So this is the kind of poetry we read, and for me, like, poetry was something, I mean, I loved writing it, but I wasn't immersed in it in any way. If I would want to know who's like a famous poet nowadays in Germany, I would probably have to Google that. So this is how I was raised with poetry, which was like, poetry is a nice, easygoing thing you do when you're maybe in love with someone. It is not something that you use to overthrow a dictatorship.
Yeah.
So that is a question that probably also guided me through my research, and that I myself asked a lot. But I believe I would very much be the wrong person to answer that question. I can tell you what my other interview partners said to that, which was basically like, I don't think that really is a question, because it's more part of life. I think one of my interview partners, she always mentioned it as being in the culture, and just like being in, she always said like, it's in my blood. And then another interview partner, she just said like, it is only, she lives in Britain, and she just mentioned like, around me here in Britain, that is where people believe that poetry is not necessary. So for me, like, the question is not so much like, how do people grow up around poetry and valuing that? For me, the question is more like, why don't we do that anymore?
Right.
Here in America or Austria, where I'm at, or in Germany or somewhere. Like, why don't we value that anymore? Why do we think it's not necessary? I think in many other parts of the world, poetry still is necessary and is believed to have power. And I think like, the reverse question is probably the one that would give more insight into the thing. Yeah.
Growing up, and I think I shared this with you before, poetry was played a huge part in all of our lives. And as a fighter, as an activist, that was the main thing that we used to energize the crowd. And we have so many great poets in Sudan history. Hamid, Ustaz Muhammad Al-Gaddal, who is currently fighting cancer, being sick, so we're sending him love. He played an important part in all the Sudanese life in general and our life. But anyways, I know this is a long conversation. It could go on, but what have you done that you think can be an inspiration for other women who are trying to find their way and navigate life? I'm sure you have been through struggles and failures and success. What can we use from that to benefit from?
That is a difficult question.
I know, I ask difficult questions.
It's just a very it casts a very wide net. I think for me also part of the reason why I write poetry is because it is a space to explore yourself and your identity and also the struggles. So if you would go to my poetry page and read my poetry, things I have often addressed are, for example, mental health or sexuality or feminism and our position as women in the world. And for me, like, for example, a struggle has been, I have struggled with my mental health for years, on and off. And their poetry has been a really strong factor in guiding me through that, but also like making me able to navigate it and sort of like watching yourself from the outside and giving you that reference point afterwards. So it's something you can always look back to and see like, okay, I've been through this before. If I've done this once, I can do this again. It's not that bad. And it changed again. I think this has, for me, been one of the most important lessons and something that my own poetry always shows me, because it's this, it captures a moment and you can see like, wow, I felt really, really bad in this moment. But then another moment came. And often in those moments, it feels like nothing is ever going to change again, but it does again and again and again. And you always get out of that again. And through that, you always have these reference points where even in darker times, you can see like, but it's getting better again. And sometimes you can even like, for example, this is something that I do. I write messages to myself in my poetry. And that is something that really has helped a lot. If that is something that answers your question.
Vulnerability, you know, that's almost like having your diary be public.
In a sense, yes. But then also no. I think poetry is very ambiguous, and I think the beauty of it is that you can always read into it what you need out of it. So it has been a fascinating journey to have people comment my poetry on Instagram, because sometimes I get this comment which is like, wow, and you're writing about this, and this really touched my heart. And I'm like, did I? And it's just like, I never had any intention of giving out this message. I meant something completely different, but people take away completely different things, which is fascinating to me, because I wonder what the poets I had to analyze in school would think about my analysis. But I think poetry often offers the space that you get out of it exactly what you want to get out of it. So I don't think hardly anyone has ever read a poem of mine as I wrote it. So it's not really like having your diary out there. It's more like having an encrypted version of some of your thoughts out there that anyone, or maybe it's more like putting a mirror out there and you're going to see yourself in it, but everybody else is also going to see themselves in it. That is probably a better metaphor.
That's beautiful. I mean, I bet that I bet doing poetry in a room by yourself is different than putting it out there for critique, putting it out there for interpretation, and being able to like interact with people. So is that what you're doing with your space online?
Definitely the interacting part. I think poetry has this ability to build community. And that was also something that so many people said during the Sudanese revolution, that poetry had this power to connect people. And that was something that struck me so much. So in that space, what I try to do is to connect people through poetry, but also to connect people to political issues through poetry. So I think one of my favorite sessions that I had was with a friend of mine who's from Egypt. And we used poetry and her poems to talk about women's rights in Egypt. And actually it turned into this thing where several men who were watching were like, can we ask you questions? And they started like commenting their questions and like, yeah, but how do you see religion in this? And then it became this entire conversation about women's rights in Egypt. And it was around the time where a woman, an Egyptian woman who had already fled the country, committed suicide because she was being harassed for being lesbian. So, and we talked about that and then just everything, and it really opened up spaces for people to interact. And that was just the most beautiful thing for me, that that can happen.
This is
And to
kind
me,
of
like that is to me way more inspiring than anything that I personally have to offer. Like for me, the most inspiring thing is what happens in these exchanges when people come together. So if you were asking me for something inspiring, I don't really feel like I can give something like from my story or something that also feels sort of like strange to me to do that. But I always feel extremely inspired after I've done those sessions and found these people and shared this community.
it's kind of like a conversation within a conversation, you know, where you kind of put something out there and just kind of like hold on and see where it takes you. So my question is more about like, how did the pandemic shape conversations? Were people just kind of desperate to have connection? Were there common themes throughout some of the things you guys were talking about? Talk a little bit about that.
That is an interesting question. I think in the beginning, people were really, really into having more connection. And I think right now, it's more like people are desperate for connection, but it's really difficult to get outside yourself and seek that connection. And it feels like many people are withdrawing, and even though they would want that connection, it gets more and more difficult to take that step and seek that connection. And that is something that I've seen with these events as well. Like in the beginning, there were a lot of people who really wanted to partake. And then the further the pandemic moved on, and that was also part of the reason why I stopped, because for one thing, okay, I was writing a thesis that came in between, definitely. But the other thing was also like, out of 15 people, 11 spontaneously had to cancel because they were just like, I'm not feeling well. I'm really not doing okay. I can't interact with people right now. I can't put my poetry out there. I can't actually even write. So I think connection and the loss of connection, but also increasingly the loss of the ability to even connect are two really important issues in the pandemic.
Yeah, I think that kind of speaks to the general global sense of just a low-lying amount of overwhelmed feelings, and maybe not having like a way to organize them and actually put them out. So it'll be interesting maybe as we come out of it to see, like you were talking about, going back and looking in the past. Yes, you could talk about now and you can, you know, inspire for the future, but how do we categorize the past and how we came through it? That would be an interesting space to see how poetry would reflect on the pandemic, because it's kind of been politicized, but we're all each individually in our house experiencing it in our own way.
I think what you mentioned with like this feeling, I read an article the other day which mentioned the word brain fog as a feeling that we're experiencing. And for me, that was like, yeah, that's it. It feels like brain fog. It feels like everything's a bit foggy. And for me, for example, I couldn't write that much during the pandemic. Like I did write some poems, but often it was like, because for me to write a poem, there's one sentence in my head. It's either in German or in English, because I actually write in both languages.
Mm-hmm.
And then I write the poem. And I don't think that has happened to me in a year. It is way more like thinking it through and trying to put an idea on paper. But it really feels like there has been a sort of brain fog.
Yeah.
I think that is actually a really good word. And then looking back, I think for me, it's not even so bad that I didn't put so much poetry out there, but later just going through my notes and seeing what I wrote, I think things like that can later give you sort of a tool to heal and analyze and understand what was actually happening. Because I think that is a huge thing in this pandemic, that we don't actually understand what is happening to us. I mean, we live it every day, but the scale of it all, also the dying, I mean, we have numbers, but we don't really have emotions, not collectively. And I think that in the aftermath of this, to grapple with all these emotions we have and we collectively have, and often I think we have way more emotions collectively than we think we do, because right now a lot of it feels individual, because we are in our own bubbles, we are at home, we can't really connect. But I've been talking with friends these past few days, and I said, like, I feel like this and that. And the friends were like, yeah, wow, I feel like exactly the same way. I thought I was the only one feeling like that.
Yeah.
And that is actually something why I'm really desperate to put more poetry out there again, to have this, wait a second, you also feel like that? I thought it was just me. And I think that is something we really need right now.
Yeah, like when you were talking about going back through your poems and having like a touchstone to go like, oh yeah, I felt this before. I feel like we have a lot of those that maybe we're missing because of the brain fog. We're just not even quite seeing them, but also some that we've never experienced before. Like the way that we had to adapt so rapidly, the way that we've had to almost filter in these enormous numbers and the universal scale of it all. It's like all these things like pushed together. So no, I can completely agree. Every once in a while, I'll send something to like a good friend or my sister, and we do have these like small moments of connection, but you almost have to like go through the fog to find them. Yeah. So I'm going to end with a general question. And as a poet, I'm sure you probably get asked this a lot, I would assume, but like, how do you write a poem? You said you just kind of start with an idea. It's kind of like writing a song. It kind of seems like this untouchable thing that if you don't have the skills, it's like magic. I don't even know where you begin. So for you, how does it work?
Seriously, how do people even write songs? I have no idea.
You are writing songs.
A perfect example. Like, I have no idea. I couldn't write a song. I have no idea how to write a song.
Right.
How do I write a poem? Well, for one thing, I don't try to make it rhyme. That is a very German thing. Like in Germany, if you write in German, a lot of poetry often rhymes, and that is not something that I can do at all, or well, or anything like that. for me, as I said before, like it always starts with one sentence, and I hardly ever know actually where the poem is going. Like the worst poems I write are those where I think like, okay, I have this idea, I want to write about this subject now. Like, I don't know, if something in the world happened and I really, really, really want to say something to that, I mostly fail. But then when I get this one sentence and I go from there, it sort of just flows. And I know that that is a very unsatisfying answer to give someone.
Don't feel
If
like
you ask
I
me
can
to
get
write a poem, I'm like, I just write it.
Actually, Lillian, we have someone here asking you, Ain Mim Ain, and could you recite one of your poem in English?
Well, yes, I could, but I have to search for one because here's a very embarrassing thing. I don't know a single of my poems by heart, but I have an idea. I know which one I want to recite because it's about the pandemic. And I think that it might be a poem that people could actually connect.
Do you mind if I
well with
play
right now.
some drawing from the Sudanese Revolution in the background? It can play here while you're reading your poem. How about that?
Yes, of course.
We'll give you a design.
That is perfect. And also I need a minute to find the poem. But yeah, that is definitely.
من أجلك عشنا يا وطني نفدي بالروح أراضينا قد كنا
I think you might have to turn down the volume a bit, or I have to scream against that.
I'm gonna mute the whole thing.
Okay. I measured 1 meter in longing, and never has the world been so equally near and far. Close is just out of reach, and far could be next door as well. The same city is as virtual as countries or oceans apart, and the only thing deeper than doors is time. They say no person is an island, but I am surrounded by borders, and doesn't that constitute a singular entity? Distance is no longer measured in centimeters, but pandemic labels, and also the story glow bars of my Wi-Fi connection. Touch makes the blind see. Consider this for a moment, with all its implications. But now I touch by tracing outlines of loved ones with my eyes. Maybe that's why the screen freezes. An implicit need to stop things from moving away. And staring can convince my brain it feels skin, or at least fabric, or maybe just hurting, but something. I don't know the boiling point of space, but I want this distance to be a chemical thing, so I can experiment the hell out of it and change its state of aggregation. And if I were an alchemist, I'd turn every injustice into a society that deserves the name utopia, or at least gold, so we'd remember to trace the cracks afterward. Back to normal is nothing but a cloak of invisibility. We have dragged our heroes from it, clad them in capes for a couple of weeks, applauded unwanted risk. It is so easy to overhear what comes with sacrifice when you're clapping. But under the cloak, the system's not working, and yes, we are still moving, but falling apart is a movement too. And after the cessation, shouldn't we rather look for direction? Wait till after the crisis is the battle cry of men of power, but demands to be heard and seen and treated equally are not a luxury, but a necessity. And haven't we just been taught what that truly is? The only future we see is a reimagination of the past, and even toxicity feels safe when you have known it before. But I don't want to return. I want to move and change and think thoughts that he'll smile at dismissively and have a thesaurus of sweet, sticky pity for. Maybe utopia is just a poem, but this is no longer a poem nor a lamentation. It is an act of defiance and a creation, a single thought. What if from this distance grows a thing, a collective imagination without the need to circle backwards, but move somewhere we have never been before?
Oh my God, I had to like rush to unmute myself so I can say, wow.
Wow.
I
That
thought-
had just like the vibe of everything that was going on. Like as soon as you started talking, I'm like, wow, you took me back to like a year ago of like when Zooms were still kind of cute and you were still kind of using them as a substitute to, you know, like get in touch with people. And then that slow realization of wow, it's never going back to the same, and all of the feelings that we were having. That was incredible.
Thank you so much. And because you just said like it took you back to a year ago, I actually wrote this poem a year ago. So
Wow.
this is probably also what we talked about just now, how it brings you back to moments and makes you reflect and see what was already there at times.
Yeah. Well said.
So thank you very much for this
Yeah.
opportunity.
Yeah,
and
fascinating.
asking
You
me
kind
to
of
read
bring
something.
you bring the research, the academic eye, you bring like real world experience, you bring everything that you have, everything that in your poetry. I love that you were able to go somewhere and find the beauty there and kind of present it. So I'm absolutely blown away.
And the
Absolutely.
humanitarian part, don't forget that.
Yes, yes.
And that's what drew me to you, Lillian, because thank you again. A lot of people here said thank you for bringing light into the Sudanese revolution and to poets and to this experience. And you are a humanitarian and everything else that Heather said. So thank you for coming and thank you for giving us your time. And I don't know if you have last word to say to everyone listening to us right now.
Well, honestly, I just hope that everyone's safe and holding on and trying to get through this, because this is basically what I'm doing. And I'm just so happy that we had this opportunity to connect and laugh, because that is so important. And thank you so much for inviting me. And I truly had a wonderful time with both of you.
Same here, same here. And we are going definitely to have you at some point when we have few of our other poet who they didn't do the same thing you did. To me, you did something really powerful, and you helped not just raising an awareness about the Sudanese revolution, but you raised awareness about women, and especially the part where you said you felt the same way we did, I did, and so many other women did, that the iconic picture that caught everyone's eye. It's what they wanted us to look like. This is what they want to think of female revolutionists. Just a well-dressed, nice, cute, little thing. And they don't want to see the one that are fighting, throwing, running, and looking all messed up because they were doing something to make a difference.
Maybe to that also, I think that in this case, no one should misunderstand what poetry in this can be, because it's not just being nice and just like putting some nice words together. It's about moving people and moving the masses and actually having true political impact. So this is not about women being on the sidelines or just like chanting or applauding or something. It's about women moving something and having historic, political, powerful impact. And I think that is something that picture really hides and is supposed to hide.
And with that, I am going to end today, and I'm going to show you guys a little clip from the, you call it Al-Qaeda sitting, الاحتسام, احتسام القيادة. And I would like to remember our fallen heroes and the people who lost their life to get Sudan to where it's supposed to go. Somebody here said to you, unfortunately, the force of they call it soft landing, but the current government is, as you know, Hamiti is part of the Janjaweed, and we don't, Sudanese people felt like their revolution was stolen from them. But Abdul Wahab, I'm just going to tell you, like, there are so many people out there still fighting, and they're going to get there. They just need to keep pushing, keep fighting, and hopefully the world will see and do something, act with that. Thank you again, and I'm going to play this.